Next, after, that's tomorrow, this Tuesday, December 10th at 7 o'clock, the 1916 committee will be meeting at Patrick's Pub. We'll be talking about things that we're going to be doing in the future, thinking about lectures, and I'll say a little bit about that before I close my opening here. Next Sunday is the adult Christmas party here from 2 to 6. You call the club or email or go right downstairs tonight and see Pat. And he's got the tickets, $10 for members, $15 for non-members, and children under 12 are free. Our next lecture is...
That's Tim Cohane and Paul Keneally.
Oh, okay, I didn't bring everything with me. Okay.
Thanks, Marie.
Yeah. Our next lecture is Friday, January 3rd at 7:30 p.m. Charles Brady, a native of Ireland, will be speaking on an unusual situation regarding athletes in Ireland. While the Olympics do recognize Ireland as the entire island of Ireland, all 32 counties, the World Federation of Athletes still only recognize the Irish team as representing only the Republic of Ireland, 26 counties. Charles has long been working with the group in Ireland to restore Irish athletes to have the ability to represent the entire island. Charlie will explain the politics behind the situation and how it violates the Good Friday Agreement. And also for local Rhode Islanders, Charlie is the man who runs the 5K races before the Providence and Pawtucket St. Patrick's Day Parade. He was an outstanding cross-country runner at Providence College. He is a native of Louth, Ireland. Did I say that right? Oh. And last but not least, one of the things that we're sort of working on with the 1916 committee, we haven't got it set in stone, is something that the ladies Hibernians are doing. They've created an ad hoc committee. It's called Irish Unity. I'm a member of that committee, and what is happening now is what we're going to be working for is fairness in the legacy issues that the British are trying to bury, and also to assist with however we can with Irish unity. And at the first meeting, it was decided that those of us on the committee, what we're going to do is try and educate people about what's going on. And I'm not going to go into it tonight because it's too long, but I would just like you to know that that's what we're working on. If you're interested in coming to the meeting, this Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Now, we usually open with a moment of silence for those who have gone before us. Now gives me great pleasure to introduce Jim McGetrick and Pat Brady. I don't know who's speaking first, but that's what they're talking about, the plantations. Thank you.
All right. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
We're real techies here.
The road crew didn't show up.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Brothers and sisters, friends. Welcome to the Cayley Club. Our committee has been offering lectures here at the Cayley Club on one Friday night each month, 9 months a year since 2017. These scheduled talks have sought to provide a clearer understanding of different aspects of our Irish heritage. And although we do deal with important events as they happen, I think it's fair to say that over the years, our presentations have been apt to center on some area of Ireland's history. And Ireland's history is a long one and a busy one. It's a noteworthy collection of momentous events like the Good Friday Agreement, the Troubles, the Civil War, the Easter Rising, Home Rule, the Young Islanders, the Great Hunger, the Irish Brotherhood, and many more seemingly unique and seemingly end-all crises that Ireland's culture has faced throughout the years and somehow survived. But how far back must we go to reach where our modern history really starts? Is there any particular period in our past that is a precursor to where we are today? We think there is. Tonight, we'll review the colonial policies that England mandated for Ireland in the early 1600s, policies which then crossed the Atlantic to be similarly applied in America. But first, let's define some terms that Jim and I will be using tonight. The English introduced the term plantation in reference to planting of English settlers into Irish lands that they confiscated following suppression of Irish rebellions. And tonight, the terms colony and plantation will have the same general meaning and will be used interchangeably. Now, we don't want to lose everyone by reciting technical definitions. And in my lifetime, the term colony never had any sinister connotations. There was the Old Colony Bank, the NCAA's Colonial Basketball League, the Colonial Inn, the Wild Colonial Tavern, and a bunch more. But it turns out that in our context tonight, the word's true meaning isn't so clean and pure. A colony is, in fact, a British specialty. And colonialism refers to the direct political control of a society by a foreign ruling state. The ruling power is a minority made up of foreign invaders, like the English, over a majority made up of native inhabitants, like Ulster Irish and the Native Americans. Or another way of saying this might be, being superior to the folks living there now, we therefore have the right to relegate them to subservient roles, take over their land and exploit it for our benefit. We will deploy our superior people to physically confiscate and settle lands presently occupied by their inferior people. A settler is defined as a person who migrates to a new region to live there permanently. We can keep going on these, right? And settler colonization is the large-scale immigration of settlers into a colony, creating a new society on the conquered territory that lasts there indefinitely. Adventurers were moneyed English entrepreneurs who took on the financial burden for the crown in its numerous Irish invasions and counterinsurgencies. Engaging in these enterprises for a profit, undertakers were English and Scottish men of wealth who were granted large tracts of land in the Ulster Plantation and later in America, and were responsible for planting British settlers on them. A land company. Examples of the land company would be the East India Company, and tonight it's going to be the Virginia Company. But they're private businesses, such as a joint venture stock company that was formed by a group of moneyed adventurers that received a charter to colonize and exploit land on behalf of the British Crown, thus freeing England from the financial burdens accompanying it and its imperial pursuits. The company was granted land and certain governing rights, while the other powers were granted, while other powers were retained by the Crown. And there were also three separate types of English colonies: the charter colony, proprietary colony, and the royal colony. The charter colony was granted by the Crown to a land company, again, like the Virginia Company or the East India Company. It was self-governed, was not directly ruled by the king, and for the most part was how England pursued its imperial ambitions. A proprietary colony was granted by the Crown to an individual who then had total control, including authority to select the colony's official and the governors. Example I'll use of a proprietary colony tonight would be Walter Raleigh, down in, he was special. He was down in Virginia. And a royal colony was directly controlled by the king through a royal governor. The king owned the colony and used it specifically to generate wealth for England. And they all ended up as being royal colonies. The 13 colonies that were in the Revolution, they were royal colonies, but they didn't start out that way. So that's it for the background info we wanted to give you. We hope you enjoy the lecture.
Okay, I want to time this meeting, but we're trying to keep it within certain limits. Not everybody does that comes here. Oh, sorry. Okay, first off, I want to make everyone clear. I am not a historian. I like history. I read about history. Pat is the same way. And we decided to take up this topic. I thought my head would explode before I got here tonight because there's just so much to go over. But the Ulster Plantation is a critical event in Irish history. Irish history is just constantly shaped by being collateral damage to events that happen somewhere else. The Ulster Plantation is one of those examples. It was formally started in 1606. It was characterized by the removal of Irish natives from the land and resettled by British and Scottish settlers, as Pat just defined. This plantation changed the character of Ulster, the northeast part of the country. To this very day, the effects of this plantation reverberate in Ireland. It's the reason for the partition of Ireland into two countries in 1921. It is also how the British have maintained a stranglehold on the 6 counties of Ulster today. But before we can start with the ins and outs of the plantation in 1606, we have to go back a little further to understand how this was possible. Let's take a look at Europe in a few centuries before the plantation. The Middle Ages were coming to an end, and so was the social and economic system that was predominant in the Middle Ages. That system is called feudalism. Here is the definition. Feudalism was a political, economic, legal, military, cultural, and social system that existed in medieval Europe from the 9th century to the 16th. A group of people known as nobles received land from the crown, kings or queens in certain cases, in exchange for military service. And that military service is where we got King Arthur's knights and all of this romantic chivalry stuff. The underbelly of feudalism is rather disgusting, but a group of other people called vassals or lords also received land from the crown and in turn had tenants living on it. Below the vassals and lords were peasants or serfs who were obligated to live on the vassal or lord's land, give him homage, labor, and a share of the produce in return for military protection. It's always interesting when you read about this to think about where you would fit in that hierarchy, you know. Who would be a king? Who would be a serf? It's all luck. Okay, this system was in place for centuries, from the 9th century. And a reason for its longevity, despite the lack of equality and injustice, the difference between the different classes, was because of a concept that was known as the divine right of kings. This was a political concept that asserted that a monarch's authority to rule came directly from God. That meant that monarchs I should have typed this out. Monarchs were not accountable to any earthly authority, and rebellion against them was considered a crime against God. Essentially, monarchs were considered God's chosen representative on earth to govern the people. Now, before this concept came into play, before the 9th century, only the Pope was considered the legal, powerful representative of God who could govern the people, and everyone owed allegiance to him. However, that changed. That's a whole other lecture, and we're not going to go into any kind of detail about that. But the divine right of kings had a huge effect on the history of Europe, the history of Britain especially, and, like I say, collateral damage to Ireland. One last thing before getting back to the Ulster Plantation. Feudalism faded away over the course of a couple of hundred years, a couple of centuries, and it was replaced by a new system. And that system is called capitalism. That's what replaced feudalism in the march of mankind here. And during this violent, bloody transition from one economic system to another, Ireland became caught in the trap of the changing of the guard, so to speak, of the two economic systems. It manifested itself in many different ways, and I'm going to go through some of the progress that affected Ireland in such a bad way. Can I see the first slide? So before the plantation, this is a map of Ireland, 1450. And if you notice, there is an area of blue and an area of gray. The area of gray, it says the Pale. There were 4 counties at that time that were considered the Pale: Dublin, Louth, Meath, and Kildare. They were under English rule. The rest of the country, if you got a close-up of the map, the names around the green are family names. They're clan names. They were tribes. They ruled that land as a family or as a tribe. The English law was only enforced in the Pale. The rest of the country was independent. They did their own thing, the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, you could go through all those names, the Maguires, etc. And those people had their own disagreements and battles, but they remained independent from England and the Crown. Now, the area in green was rebellious, refused to take the law from England, and it was Gaelic chieftains who were ruling the rest of the country. That whole area was called beyond the Pale. So you're either in the Pale or you're beyond the Pale. The dictionary definition of beyond the Pale means beyond the bounds of acceptable behavior. So you had 28 counties that were beyond the Pale there. So, okay, moving right along. Another important event that was to shake Ireland in 1517 was, of course, the Protestant Reformation, okay? That's a whole other lecture, but it happened before the Ulster Plantation and its ramifications across Ireland. Another figure who had a lot to do with Ireland during this time is a guy called Henry VIII. Now, most people here know that Henry had a lot of issues, particularly with women, but one of the issues he had was Ireland. Ireland refused, the Irish Parliament refused to recognize him because of what he did. He turned his back on the Pope, he started his own church, he wasn't a Catholic anymore, and the Irish Parliament ignored him. He didn't like this, and after leaving the Catholic Church and defying the Pope, Henry declared himself the King of Ireland. There had never been a King of Ireland. All these chieftains and tribes, nobody ever asserted the authority of the divine right or the king. Henry VIII did, and he did it through the divine right of kings. So you can see the conflict that we're heading towards here. There was resistance throughout the country, especially in Ulster, was the strongest opposition to English rule during this time. Led by a family of the O'Neills, the Maguires, the O'Donnells. They fought against, it was Elizabeth was on the throne now. Henry VIII died before these battles took place. This is in the early 1600s, and these family chieftains and the Gaelic aristocracy at the time fled Ireland to Europe. This is known as the Flight of the Earls. And what happened as a result of it is that all the area of the country that is in green was kind of leaderless. The organization had broken down and society really suffered. And of course they were oppressed. This left, them leaderless and very vulnerable. And at the time, England saw the opportunity that while the earls had flown away to Europe, Ireland was weakened, and they thought that this was the time to strike. And when we get to part 2, we'll continue with the plantation of Ulster. Pat will take over and bring it to the North American shore.
Yeah. Okay, now tonight we're comparing Ireland with the colonies in North America. Well, looking out at at the crowd tonight, I would imagine that those of you who grew up and went through school in Rhode Island, as I did, were all taught pretty much the same story of the country's early colonial days. The clean, industrious pilgrims in search of religious freedom setting out on the Mayflower in 1620 for Plymouth, the friendly Indians welcoming them on Plymouth Rock, and then the warm camaraderie resulting in the first Thanksgiving. But this tale of America's colonial history is vague and leaves too much to the imagination. First of all, the pilgrims were different, very different, from other settlers that got here a little earlier. They were Puritan Calvinist Puritans, I'm not really sure about that, who as a group felt that they had to escape England's religious suppression. They moved to Holland for about 10 years before deciding to continue on to America. And the Mayflower's passenger list included entire families, skilled tradesmen, soldiers, merchants, educated leaders, all components for a stable community. The Mayflower was supposed to land in an area controlled by the Virginia Company, near New York. But they missed, and instead they ended up near Cape Cod and outside of the Virginia Company's boundaries. So instead of a charter, the Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact and they governed themselves independently. But rather than being the rule for early colonizing efforts in America, however, the Pilgrims were the exception to the rule. The Jamestown colony, named after England's King James I, was established in 1607 on a peninsula, also named after James, down in Virginia. It was backed by over 30 London merchant investors calling themselves the Virginia Company, which was a business organization with large sums of capital invested by adventurers whose chief interests lay in the returns expected from those investments. But its colonization. I speak no languages fluently. But its colonization efforts weren't received well at all, and undertakers proved hard to come by, even as the company vowed to remove swarms of idle persons from England and set them to work in Virginia. It was a tough sell until England began enforcing its enclosure bills, which had been steadily enacted over the years. Lands that had been owned in common for ages were now privatized and surrounded by walls and fences and hedges, changing England's landscape as the masses had their ancestral homelands expropriated and their labor power redeployed in new economic projects and in new geographic settings. This rudderless pool of evicted smallholders and displaced rural tenants that had once been sustained on public commons was now forced to seek work in the city, becoming an unexpected drain on England's already crowded metropolises. By the end of the 16th century, there were 12 times as many propertyless people as there had been 100 years earlier. But the Virginia Company saw things differently and considered that the expropriation of the commons was incredible good fortune, coinciding neatly with its colonization plans. The destitute peasants offered England an advantage in its late entry into the European scramble for the New World colonies. For unlike Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands or France, England found itself with a desperate surplus population that it could redeploy overseas. England's rulers used its conquest of Ireland as a model for moving people to where they were needed. It passed banishment legislation aimed at the Irish, the Gypsies, and the Africans. And in 1594, all native Irish who were living in England were commanded to leave, and those who remained were shipped to Virginia as slaves. Press gangs plucked up the poor and dispossessed in the port cities of London, Bristol, Liverpool, Dublin, and Cork, and shipped them to Virginia. Prisons were a further source of needed settlers, regardless of what, if anything, they had been locked up for, and whether they be ordinary sailors, convicted felons, or just unlucky children. Some 200,000 ended up on America's shores in the 17th century. Some were convicted of crimes and sent there as penal servitude, others kidnapped and shanghaied, and still others who went by choice, though often desperate choice, exchanging several years' labor as indentured servants for the prospect of land and their own independence afterward. So in many ways, Virginia's plantations became a dumping ground for England's most unwanted inhabitants, and that included the Irish. In 1585, Queen Elizabeth issued a proprietary charter to Sir Walter Raleigh to set up a colony at Roanoke, Virginia. Raleigh was a particularly onerous character in Ireland's history. He had earlier led the English forces to victory at the siege of Smerwick in Munster during Ireland's Desmond Rebellion, and the Queen had awarded him 40,000 acres because of his efforts there, making him one of Munster's largest landholders at the time. Elizabeth may possibly have thought that Sir Walter was her kind of guy when she found out that he ordered over 600 of the soldiers who surrendered to him there at Smerwick to have their heads chopped off. From a comfortable seat in London, where he was knighted and given the title Lord and Governor of Virginia, Raleigh directed 3 colonizing expeditions to Roanoke in the 1580s, and he named that area Virginia in honor of his Virgin Queen. His first try in 1585 ended poorly. Within a year, only about 100 colonists were left of the 600 who had started out, and they all sailed back to England after never receiving the necessary provisions that Raleigh had promised them. At the same time, Raleigh's tardy supply ship that bore those missing supplies was heading west to Roanoke. But unable to locate the colonists or their colony, it promptly sailed back to England. But Sir Walter, never the quitter, never one to quit, in 1587 sent a new expedition bearing 117 settlers. When it landed, the local Indians were quick to kill a few of them who had gone out fishing, and some others were killed during attempts at establishing friendly relations with the local tribe. Those attempts were, needless to say, unsuccessful. A colony leader was sent back to England for provisions they desperately needed after peace was established. He sailed off in 1587, but didn't return for 3 years, and by that time the colony was gone. Its disappearance could have been caused by any number of reasons, including disease, violence, and drought, but regardless, it would be known thereafter as the Lost Colony, and to this day, its fate remains a mystery. And that was it for Sir Walter. He got out of the colony-forming business, and his fortunes went downhill after Elizabeth passed away in 1602. He was beheaded for treason after spending several unpleasant years in the Tower of London following her death. And as I mentioned briefly a little earlier, in 1607, 104 men and boys put ashore in what is now Jamestown, Virginia. It would be another 9 months before any woman were allowed. The trip ran into trouble right from the start. The site was swampy and plagued by mosquitoes. The tidal river was undrinkable. The farming space was limited. Disease and famine wrecked the population and death rolls were high. Settlers were barely hanging on. A fleet that had set off from England loaded with fresh supplies and 470 new colonists encountered a hurricane, washing away its relief cargo before it finally limped into Jamestown empty, except for the over 400 additional mouths to feed. Then the Powhatan Indians laid siege to the settlement. A tentative peace was eventually established, but during that winter of 1609-1610, over 80% had starved to death. Trapped by hostile Indians in the harsh, freezing winter, the colony ate their way through their livestock, with their pets next on the menu, shortly followed by resident rats and mice, and then apparently the residents themselves. Only 60 colonists were alive when a new relief ship finally arrived just in the nick of time. The colony had very narrowly escaped total failure and abandonment, and this after the Virginia Company had poured people and resources into it with a zero return on investment. But by 1612, the settlers had started to grow tobacco and over a short period of time, that crop transformed the colony from a near disaster into a very successful venture, and leading in 1619 to the first representative assembly in North America, and to the first importation of African slaves.
Meanwhile, back in Ulster at the same time, so those first slaves arrived in Jamestown 1619. We're talking 1606 in Ulster at this time. It's Queen Elizabeth's reign and soon to be followed by James I. Let me just get this going here. I don't want to... Okay. Now, Ireland in 1609, when the Ulster Plantation really seriously began, had been at war for 80 years. The society had been totally turned upside down. The earls had left. It was leaderless in opposition to England. And the English realized that the Irish were in a position of weakness and thought that this would be a good opportunity to assert more authority over them. And they did, with a vengeance. Now, on the other hand, many of us have heard the song made famous by Christy Moore. I forget the actual author, but the song is called Irish Ways and Irish Laws. And one of the verses says, "Again, again, the soldiers came, burnt our houses, stole our grain, shot the farmers in their field, working for a living." I'd like to sing the song, but when my mother gave me money for singing lessons, I bought cigarettes instead, so I'll just let it go like that. So these Irish laws that the song refers to are called Brehon laws, B-R-E-H-O-N. It was the legal system that the green area there was adjudicated by. And the British had to change this. They defined these laws as barbarous and uncivilized, and they replaced it with what is known as English common law. Brehon law was outlawed throughout the island. The most fundamental changes were this. The Irish system of succession in the tribes or clans, where all those family names are, it was determined when a leader died that the British felt this was unreasonable because the Brennan law relied on debate and an election to choose the successor, to choose the new leader. And that was outlawed. It was replaced by the concept of, I think you say this, primogenitor. The eldest son automatically became the successor. What could possibly go wrong with a system like that? even worse was the effect it had on Irish women. Now, throughout Irish history, if you go back to ancient times, there are many, many examples of famous, powerful Irish women who ruled clans and tribes. They were elected to that position and had very successful reigns. But the New English Common Law said, oh no, women could not hold property independently of their husband. Brehon law was condemned because it endowed women with the power of disposing of goods without the consent of the husband. What is wrong with that? I wonder. It would be so much better. Okay, so that's like the background of what's happening here when the Ulster Plantation comes in. It was right around 1610 when Brehon law was outlawed. So in order, like Pat said, what the plantation was that land was granted to people called undertakers who were given the land by the king, and they promised to bring at least 25 families from Britain or Scotland to live on the land and make it productive. So it wasn't easy to get people to come. Pat was saying about the high unemployment, about the overpopulation. There were agricultural changes in England that created a underclass that could no longer be tied to the land, and they gravitated towards cities where Pat described the kind of problems that people faced, not very much unlike today, right? So in order to attract people to go to Ulster, a propaganda campaign was started. Now, of course, this is 1610 we're talking about. There was no television, no radio, nothing like that. People heard word of mouth from people in power. So the propaganda campaign was aimed at getting people to move to Ulster and settle on the land. It had three main components. The first was that the people in Ireland, in Britain and Scotland had to be convinced that this was perfectly morally okay to just go and take somebody else's land. And the way that was brought about was because the Irish people, it turns out, were, just not civilized. They were characterized as being savages, barbarians. It went on, and people believed it, of course. The Irish were described to people in Scotland and the slums of London as being savages, barbaric, lazy, drunks. They spoke an inferior language. They didn't belong to the right religion and had no morals. It was rumored that Irish women walked around naked, which explained the high population in Ireland. And they were also uneducated, despite the fact that it was one of the most educated countries in the world at the time. The second part of the propaganda campaign was just the opposite. Instead of, on one hand, you're painting this ugly picture of the people, the other hand, you are describing the Garden of Eden in Ulster, the most beautiful, fertile land on God's earth was in Ulster. And all you had to do was go over there and start plowing the fields, and money was going to come in, and you'd have all of this wealth that get you out of the ghetto in London. Of course, a lot of people in this room have been to Ireland, and there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, there is some gorgeous, fertile land, but there's some rocky soil too, And so you had no guarantee when you got there. And of course, who has the money, he's going to get the good land. And these settlers come over, and they realize it's not quite working out. Another aspect was that of the propaganda was that they rewrote Irish history in such a way as to make it seem the whole history of Ireland was just primitive, uneducated savages living, wild lives, not having, the education that the British people had, etc. And all of these things combined, and they did attract people to go over there. And when they got there, unfortunately, there were people living there who didn't look it's like savages or uneducated or anything like that. And it turned out that there was going to be resistance. Anytime there's something like this happens, people are going to resist against it. And to ensure that this was going to be successful, any tenant who went over there with an undertaker or to be an independent agent had to be Protestant, had to swear an oath to the crown, and had to speak English exclusively. So this eliminated the whole 75% of the population of Ireland at the time, and the Gaelic Irish, and they were consequently removed from the land because they couldn't even become like sharecroppers on that thing. And this was a new concept that became developed with the Ulster Plantation. And this goes back to the transition from feudalism to capitalism. What the Crown did, and this was based on previous attempts at plantation. There was a plantation in Munster and Odds, another one, which failed, just like Pat was talking about the ones in Virginia. Early ones failed. The Crown had invested money in sending people over there, and it didn't work out. So what happened here in Ulster was that the whole operation was actually financed by private capital. The London guilds of skilled tradesmen had wealth to spare, and they invested in the undertakers going over to Ulster in order to, maximize profit. The king, or the crown, was interested in this because, of course, England has always been in wars with Spain and France and everything like that, and were always afraid that Ireland on their flank could be taken over by another country, which then could use Ireland as, a starting base to take over England. That never happened, right? And I got to speak fast now. But that never happened, and Ireland, fought back every attempt at anything like that, and it was only the English that they really had a fight. But the guilds, what they did was to financially underwrite the undertakers and the settlers who went, and they got the profit out of it. What the crown got out of it was these loyal subjects to protect the flank of England. In order to do that, the crown agreed that there would be certain financial arrangements with the Ulster Plantation people. They eliminated the need for those people to pay customs on goods that they shipped back to England. Everywhere else in Europe, they had to pay customs. For 7 years, the people on the Ulster plantations, if they sent food or timber, which was in big demand in England, it was duty-free, in other words. And that increased the profit of the London guilds. It increased the profit of the Ulster plantation people, but it also secured for the crown loyal people there. That's like what we hear today in America about tax breaks when a corporation moves into Smithfield and they don't have to pay taxes for 5 years and then they move away. This is the same kind of deal. Of course, in Ireland, nobody's more famous for tax breaks than the Republic of Ireland. But this was a smart move in the changing of, whereas the king once controlled all of these finances, now they were breaking down, and the king had lost that amount of power, in this case to the guilds, but as time went on, he would lose it more and more. There was, I'm gonna skip a little bit here, but this was segregation of the first class, where Irish had to move, native Irish had to move off these lands. There's a saying called to hell or Connacht. Connacht was regarded as a backwoods area of Ireland and very impoverished, etc. And if you were you had to go to Connacht, or you were going to hell because you were going to get killed in the resistance. There was constant resistance, though. In 1641, there was a reorganization of some of these clans, and the O'Neills were revived, and they struck back, and they struck back in a very meaningful way in Ulster and outside of Ulster. These rebellions were people trying to take back their land from people who had stolen it from them. In the process, there were massacres of these settlers, which, you know, they wouldn't leave, I guess. Many of them did leave, and this created great propaganda in England that the Irish were doing this to the Cape subjects. Now, the result of that is it was actually a little bit successful because of the events going on in England at the time. Like I say, Ireland is just collateral damage all the time. And what was going on in England at that time was called the English Civil War. And the English crown was being challenged by the Puritans, who Patrick was speaking about, okay? The Puritans were a religious cult, I guess we call it now, that challenged the king because, although they were Protestants, they felt that the monarchy lived too wealthy a lifestyle, and they weren't religiously devoted enough and humble, etc. And this, while this was going on in the Irish Parliament, the Irish clans struck in an act of rebellion. This is a long tradition in Ireland. If you know the history of the 1916 rebellion, the reason why it took place in 1916 was because England was engaged in the World War I, and their back was turned to Ireland. Excuse me, and the leaders knew that this was an opportunity. England's misfortune is Ireland's opportunity. It started with this here. The English Civil War ended in 1649. The result of it, and this is a whole other lecture, of course, but the result of it was that the monarchy was ended and the Puritans won. And Oliver Cromwell was the leader of the Puritans. In 1649, Cromwell went to Ireland after the execution of James I. Okay, so in other words, the whole monarchy was beheaded or driven out of England, and it became a republic for I think 11 years or 12 years is all, and then they came back. But Cromwell was pissed at the Irish for doing what they did. When he was fighting the Civil War, there was all this talk over there. So he landed in Ireland in 1649 with 20,000 well-trained soldiers from the war and a navy, and set out to get revenge on these clans. This was indiscriminate, rampant burning of every Catholic church that could be found, and massacres of thousands of people. The entire town of entire town, Shahida was one that was in particular almost wiped off the map. The fact that it came back was almost a miracle. And you had to be able to prove that you were on the side of the parliamentarians, on Cromwell's side, not the monarchy's side, during the Civil War. Many of the Irish leadership, they were on the monarchy's side because they knew to get treated better by Charles I, who was married to a Catholic, than Cromwell, who was a fanatic Protestant. So before the end of the century, many other battles were fought, but Cromwell asserted authority over the entire island. His name is still hated in a lot of Ireland today. People will never forget what he did. There were other incidents that we don't have time to go into leading up to the 1700s. The Battle of the Boyne took place, William of Orange. These stories could go on. And it just, again, shows you how much Ireland didn't have its fate in its own hand. It was always being tossed and turned by things that were going on in either England or the rest of Europe. And as a result, you can only say that it's remarkable that it is still almost a whole country to this day, because the debt that we owe to the people who preserved the history. After, in the 1700s, the penal laws came, that people couldn't go to school, couldn't go to church, couldn't speak the language, but still, all of that survives to this day with people still fighting for it. But this is a direct result of the Ulster Plantation. Oh, I'm sorry, could you show the next slide here? And this is an idea of how this history takes place. This is the 1610, okay, when we're talking about this. These are the counties. There's 32 counties in Ireland, still are today. But two of them down here, one is called Kings County, and the other is called Queens County. Today we call them Laois and Offaly. So that's a history of the Ulster Plantation to the best of my ability to give it to you. But anyway, Pat is going to continue with the North American, and then we're going to try to conclude it. Thank you for your attention.
Meanwhile, back in America. England's exhibitions to colonize America in many ways mirrored its plantation efforts in Ireland. Its rhetoric painted a goal of planting colonies in both places so as to establish civilization in what were wild and barbarous lands occupied by wild and barbarous people. The Irish maintained a primarily pastoral economy in Ulster. They favored grazing over farming, and they considered land rights belonging to the entire clan rather than to the individual. American Indians looked at things similarly, with no conception of private property and precious little notion for work itself. There were few Irish towns or villages of any considerable size, and those staying in them were very mobile. The Indians likewise lived in widely scattered villages, with the surrounding wilderness serving as their hunting ground. The English labeled both of these unwilling participants in its colonial efforts as uncivilized. In England's eyes, they shared low-level standards of living, poor religious choices, shaky governments, and questionable moral reckoning. But it was English that they were being compared to, so inevitably this led to the question of whether the Irish and the American Indian cultures would ever be capable of living up to England's gold standard. Or, as one nobleman wrote, I'll try to do this, they did not exist any form of society or government more distinguished or more excellent or more appropriate than that which has elevated England to the height of perfection. So to the English, the barbarity of the Irish matched the savagery of the American Indians. But a question, there's a lot of us Irish around today. What happened to the Indians? England needed to base its colonial claim in America on some legal principle, so it used res nullius, that's Latin for empty things, and that says that in which all empty things were free to be taken by those who could improve on them. This made the North American continent appear as a fruit ripe for picking by the English. England's bogus version of res nullius was applied to the widely scattered villages surrounded by large wilderness that Native Americans inhabited. The colonial government then granted out large parcels of the land it had expropriated from the Indians to undertakers, with instructions on how to subdivide repeatedly into smaller and smaller grants. The decision to make relatively small grants in the Virginia colony probably took its cues from the recent example set in the Ulster Plantation. Prior to 1600, it had been estimated that there were as many as 60,000 Indians living in southern New England alone. 75 years later, the number had fallen to 10,000. And across the same time frame, England's colonial population rose roughly from 0 to 70,000 settlers. Today, there are 44,000 Indians in all of New England. Relations between English colonists and Native Americans were generally peaceful for the first 50 years or so after the Pilgrims arrived. The native people initially welcomed the newcomers, but the diseases brought by the brought from Europe killed much of the indigenous population, though that cause does not stand alone. Countless Native Americans also succumbed to murder, gross mistreatment, starvation, exposure, exhaustion, and even general despair. The major known tribes included the Wampanoag, 40,000 tribal members living in 67 villages in southern Massachusetts made up the Wampanoag Nation in the 1600s. They fished, they farmed, they did everything according to the seasons. The Wampanoag's numbers diminished steadily as colonists and the diseases they carried disrupted traditional ways of life. Today there are only 6,400 tribal members left in the Wampanoags. The Massachusetts, this tribe lived in more than 20 villages distributed along the Massachusetts coast near what is now Boston. In 1600 they numbered 3,000 people, but they had already been decimated by 1623 when Miles Standish invited their chief and several warriors to a supposedly peaceful summit near today's city of Weymouth, where Standish poisoned and murdered most of them. The head of the chief was cut off and displayed on a pole so tribal members would know what awaited future challenges to Pilgrim authority. In 1633, a smallpox epidemic wiped out most of what remained of the tribe, and a census taken in 1849 determined that it then consisted of only 10 females. The Nipmuc, their tribal name means freshwater fishing place, which accurately describes their home territory around where Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts share a common border. There were some 3,000 Nipmuc farmers, fishermen, and hunters occupying 39 villages. But then English colonists arrived, surveyed their land, and named it the Confiscated Plantation. Plots were laid out for settlements, and by 1673, settlers began to move in, replacing the Nipmuc. Today there are 600 active members of the Nipmuc tribe. Narragansetts. There were over 30,000 Narragansetts at the start of the colonial days. Their domain included all of southern Rhode Island, laying west of Narragansett Bay. The Narragansetts were the largest and most powerful tribe in New England at that time. In 1675, colonists massacred 1,000 of them, most of them women, kids, and old folk, at their winter camp at the Great Swamp in South Kingston. They never recovered, suffering a steady loss of land and population during the following 2 centuries until only 80 tribal members were counted in Rhode Island's 1832 census. In 1880, in a final land grab, and one that was also a violation of federal law, the state of Rhode Island passed an act to abolish the tribal authority and tribal relations of the Narragansett tribe of Indians in order to detribalize them and get at their 15,000 acres of reservation land. Today, the Narragansetts have about 2,400 tribal members. The Pequot. The tribe was located along the Thames River in present-day Connecticut and numbered roughly 2,200 members in 1600. English colonists and their Mohegan and Narragansett allies surprised them in the main village of Mystic in 1637, setting fire to the wigwams and slaughtering the 400 or so who were there at the time. Most managed to escape, and those that did manage to escape were captured and sold into slavery. Today, the Mashantucket Pequot tribal nation has about 1,200 members, and it owns and operates the Foxwoods Casino. The Mohegans, originally Pequots, the Mohegans became independent and in 1637 allied with the English colonies against the Pequot. They were led by a praying Indian Christian convert chief named Uncas. Remember that name, Uncas. Their population grew significantly, and they were a dominant tribe in the region after they teamed up with the English. The tribe today is doing well with about 2,500 members, and it owns and operates Mohegan Sun Casino in Uncasville, Connecticut. And lastly, the Abenaki. This tribe had over 10,000 members in 1600 and had occupied present-day Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and parts of Quebec for thousands of years, moving seasonally to hunt and fish. When Europeans arrived, the Abenaki quickly adapted to the fur trade, becoming skilled trappers and traders, and often interacting with the French colonists. But the English treated them poorly. They invaded their lands, they kidnapped the Abenaki people and used them as slaves. Today there are about 3,200 Abenaki left, and they live in New Hampshire and around Lake Champlain and Vermont. So, America's total population of natives fell from 10 million in 1600 to about 3.3 million today. In South America and Central America are included in it. There's an 85% reduction in tribal members since Christopher Columbus set foot in America in 1492.
Okay, this is the conclusion. And we set out with a goal to get this done in 50 minutes, and we came damn close. I'm surprised. I just in summation, in conclusion, and in attempt to compare and contrast these two plantation settlements, etc. I'd just like to make the point that it's so true. If you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat it. And one thing that was very clear about this British imperialism, colonialism, however you want to define it, is the fact that they felt morally superior to the inhabitants of wherever they went. It didn't stop in North America. I mean, think about India, the Congo, my God. And their sense of moral superiority gave them a license to commit terror and genocide and destroy actual tribes, as Pat just described. And when you think about the situation in retrospect, you notice there was no discussion about assimilating into the land where they were immigrating to, or taking on the practices of the people who lived there. Instead, it was just the opposite. And we hear that echo, don't we, all the time in the echo chamber of America, that people are coming and they won't assimilate, and like these people who started our country assimilated. But beyond that, the situation in Ireland today is still suffering from the plantation. The 6 counties of Ulster, of course, during the plantation, there were 9 counties that were planted, and the partition of Ireland, they decided they only wanted 6. It was going to be 6 counties with a Protestant majority. It was described as a Protestant state for a Protestant people, and that was how they defined it. And it hasn't changed very much, despite armed revolution in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to try to get the British to leave. They're still denying these basic rights that people have been fighting for. Marie was mentioning one of the projects of the 1916 committee is to fight against the Legacy Act. The British Parliament 2 years ago passed a law that said no British officials or soldiers can be penalized for what they did in Ireland during the Troubles. This means that the people who were responsible for the bombs in Dublin and Monaghan in 1974 that killed 43 people, innocent people, unannounced bombs, which no doubt were provided by the British state. There can't be any further investigations into who did it. The Dublin government has requested since 1974 information from the British government. They refused to give it. So that's an example of that moral superiority that still exists to this day, and why the Irish are still fighting, now non-violently, for a united country. It's remarkably different, though, than what Pat described. When you see the decimation of the Native Americans, that there is very little fight back, you know? And I just wish, Joe Biden would pardon Pelletier instead of Hunter, you know? It's just remarkable in my mind that, of course, they're morally superior anyway in the White House. But So this is how what we tried to do tonight was to bring a human face to this whole history. And no matter how many times I do this, and I encourage anybody that has even a thought of looking back at Irish history, you go to the library, there are all sorts of books, and it's just fascinating to see how the collateral damage that Ireland has been all these years, all these centuries, just getting banged this way and that way. You know, it's a lot better, you know, since 1916 or 1921 than it used to be, but it's still this crazy situation. You look at a map, why isn't it one country? Like, it's crazy. The only one that compares to is Sudan and Korea. And look how good they're doing. Even Vietnam's united. Like, it's an amazing thing in my mind, but it has to do with the British still can't admit a mistake, and they've made many of them, and they apologize every now and then when their backs to the wall, but they won't admit that they never should have cut the country in pieces like that. So anyway, this is the lecture for tonight, comparing these two things. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was educational and informative. And if anyone has had any questions for Pat, feel free to just ask him, okay? Seriously, any questions, any clarification? Yeah, back.
Just a comment. The idea of the Ulster Plantation is still present, very subtly, very underground. In the 80s, when we had the program that brought kids over from the north of Ireland, you could tell which kids were Protestant by their surnames versus Catholic kids. So the Protestant kids were like Young or Smith or Jones, and the Catholic kids were O'Leary, Donahue, etc. So, and that's all dating back to the Ulster Plantation, when those ancestors were settled in the land of Ulster. So,
Very true.
well,
Francis?
that's all I have to
Another
say.
comment. Okay, that's just parts of some of the Ulster Plantation. The Catholics, as James I hated the Highlands and the Catholics. So Highlanders went over there, and my ancestors from the lowlands, they settled over the Ulster Plantation.
Thank you for that information.
So, the Scotch Irish in America, they were responsible for a lot